The gods' wood at Winterfell held its breath beneath a sky bruised with evening. Snow moved like sifted ash in the air, and the heart tree's white boughs drank the dusk in silence. Sansa Stark stood with her gloved palm resting on the weirwood's cold skin, feeling that old, uncanny steadiness the tree offered. A patience larger than her griefs and cleverer than any courtier. The red eyes bled their slow sap and watched her without judgment. Ravens murmured somewhere high, invisible among the bare limbs. The wind threaded through her hair the way it had when she was a girl. It was the only touch she fully trusted. She did not come to ask the old gods for counsel anymore. She came to measure her counsel against the grove's implacable stillness. The godswood had endured kings and queens, wolves and winter, burning and rebuilding, and it waited for no one. If she seemed a queen to those who knelt and shouted and brandished swords, the gods knew better. Sansa had learned that the shape of power mattered less than its uses. She heard the crunch of snow behind her and did not turn. Brienne's footfalls were distinct, careful, generous. The guardianship Brienne gave her was a constant like the cold, sharp enough to wake you, not unkind. "Lady Sansa," Brienne said softly, "a raven has come from the south. Tyrion Lannister writes from the ruins of King's Landing. There will be a council. They ask for you." "Do they?" Sansa said, her breath a fleeting ghost on the air. Brienne extended the parchment. The seal was wax, half-stamped, as if applied by a tired hand. Sansa broke it and read in the dimming light. Tyrion's words bore his old economy. Ash, rebuilding, a council of lords, the matter of a throne that had melted in dragonfire. He asked for her presence not as a petitioner, but as someone who understood what it meant to rule a people who had no luxury to forgive mistakes. She folded the letter once more. The city burns, and they still think to sit in a circle and decide who will sit in the next circle. Brienne's mouth quirked, her version of a smile. "He says it would help to have your voice. They always want my voice after they spend the winter shouting." Sansa smoothed the parchment in her hands, then gave it back. "We ride at first light." When she left the godswood, the courtyard lamps flared in the wind, the snow acquiring a brief, golden spin before surrendering to the dark. On the battlements, men walked with their cloaks more tightly drawn. In the great hall, movement slowed around her as it always did, eyes widening in a mix of relief and hesitation. She had made herself into someone who remembered names, who forgave late taxes and bad harvests, who sent grain to Broken Hill villages without ceremony, who exchanged one quiet kindness for another until a net of obligations fit the north with a warmer thread than iron alone. Power was a company of small, exacting labors. It was the ledger kept neatly, the widow's roof resealed before the snow turned to creeping ice. It was the truth told a month late but told nonetheless. She wore a heavy gray gown trimmed with white fur, and she moved through Winterfell as if she had walked the map of it behind her eyelids for years. That night she did not sleep. The old wolves howled once to the east and again to the north. The memory of other nights kept watch with her. A candle guttering in the room where she learned how to speak without speaking. The press of a man's hand and the blueprint of terror carved into the shape she had once assumed the world made for her. She had a face now that men could not read without discomfort. She had grown it deliberately. Courtesy as armor, Ned had never needed to teach her. It had come in time, hammered by grief, cooled against her own stern patience. She would take no more diagrams from anyone's hands. At dawn, the party assembled in the yard. The horses stamped, their breath fogging heavily. Brienne swung up astride a gray mare. Podrick rose beside her, quick and cheerful despite the cold. Lord Glover's eldest rode with them as envoy of his father, and Lady Alice Karstark's cousin, lean and silent, took the rear. Sansa rode a black horse with a white star on its forehead, the reins wrapped in gloved hands. She looked up once toward the ramparts. A single raven watched. Another launched itself and vanished into the pale light, its black wings cutting a harsh curve against the snow. The road south was a thread dug between white and white. The world narrowed to motion and breath and the patient forward leaning of riders who knew the weight of miles. She listened to Brienne tell Podrick, low under her breath, what forks to expect in the road. The trees grew shorter and sparser as they passed the first day, then thickened again when the land rose into low, wooded hills. On the third day, Moat Caelan's ruin lifted from the mist like a memory of teeth. The marsh beyond it breathed fog and secrets. Crannogman watchers slid among the reeds, their heads just above the water, half seen. Sansa asked to stop. Silence hummed there. On some mornings, she imagined, the old stones would carry voices. A ghost chorus of commands and glories, of fevers and arrow-broke cries. They were past all that, or told themselves they were. A narrow boat parted the marsh, and a man stepped onto the mud shore, short and narrow in the manner of all his people, with a water-weathered face and hair gone to silver. The frog spear in his hand looked like an extension of his arm. "Howland Reed?" Sansa asked. He inclined his head. "Lady of Winterfell." His eyes were the color of peat water in shade. They appraised without aggression, calculating only what needed to be known. "I had word that you would come this way. The neck watches who passes." "We go to the south," she said. "The south goes to the south," he answered. "What does the north go to?" "Someone else's quarrel." He smiled without showing any teeth. "Then send me word when." "The quarrel seeks to climb the causeway. The neck knows how to neglect what should not pass and to remember what must." She nodded, then did not say what she was thinking, that she had an idea that would require him, and not just his frog spears and soft boats. He seemed to have already measured it in her posture, in the way her hand mapped the air when she spoke. He touched the haft of his spear with 2 fingers in brief salute. "Go with care," he said, "and come back with your own choosing." King's Landing still stank when they reached it, the stink layered, white rot from buried bodies not well buried. Smoke embedded in stone like grief seeping into a house's timbers. The city's old, unfixable scent of sewage and too many people and salt. The ruins sharpened their outlines as they rode closer. The skyline had been broken to stumps and jagged edges. Here and there, scaffolding crawled up, men like ants carrying planks and ropes and buckets in a fragile defiance of gravity and fortune. The dragon's shadow lived in the very air. Sansa could feel it between her ribs. At the gate, soldiers bowed. Some stared avidly, the way men watch a storm decide whether to pass them by. Within, the streets were narrower than memory. They rode at a walk. People paused to look, with curiosity, with hunger, with anger. Sansa saw one woman sweep ashes into a pile with a bundle of rags. A little boy dragged a stick as if it were a sword. A thin girl shifted a baby from one hip to another and never took her eyes off the riders. In the Red Keep, what had not fallen had been shored. The throne room was an exposed ribcage, the sun pouring in through a hole in the roof like a blade of heat. The throne itself was gone. Melted, Tyrion told her later, into glassy lumps and black rivers that had hardened, ugly and useless. The emptiness where the iron chair had once bullied space felt almost holy. Men and women moved around it as if something invisible still glowered there. They gathered in a lesser hall, for once a generous phrase, for it was still large enough to contain a mapped world of grudges. Tyrion rose as Sansa entered and bowed. His face had become a paler map of old weather. Lines had deepened around his mouth. His eyes carried an alert sadness that did not prevent wit but measured the cost of it. "Lady Sansa," he said, and the years contracted and loosened again in an instant. "Winterfell sends us its best, as always. Only because it has sent so many of its worst to the ground," she said, not unkindly. They sat. Around them the voices established their pecking order by volume and bravado. Lord Edmure Tully stood in his carefully good cloak, his hands tight on the back of his chair. Lord Yohn Royce's face was a mountain of stone in sunlight. Impassive, even handsome in a severe way, with that implacable calm behind the eyes. Yara Greyjoy slouched like a wolf at the edge of a flock, amused by it all, her short hair falling over one eye. Ser Davos Seaworth slid in with apology, like a man who has already made his apology so often that he keeps it in a pocket. Samwell Tarly's quill whispered at the far end. On the back benches, faces Sansa did not know belonged to newer powers in the Reach and the Westerlands. Men who had survived the long fire by being beneath it. then had scurried into sunlight when the tall ones burned and died. Tyrion raised his hands. The murmur subsided in layers, reluctantly. "You all know why we're here," he said. "What you don't know is how to do it. But we are in that rare and brief space between the end of the last mistake and the beginning of the next. I propose we use it." "Noble words," Yara muttered, but she did not rise. Davos leaned forward. "The city needs grain. The city needs roofs that won't fall on a man when he sleeps. The city needs, 7 hells forgive me, less talk and more timber. The city needs a king," said a grim Westerlander with a polished beard. "Or queen. Someone to answer for what is decided and to hang when it goes wrong." "A king is a symbol and a practice," Samwell said very quietly. We could consider nothing that invites riots, Tarly," the Westerlander snapped. "You are not in the citadel here." Edmure cleared his throat. Everyone looked at him. His flush rose steadily, like wine filling a cup. He seemed to be measuring himself against the length of the room and finding that he would need to speak louder than was comfortable. "I have experience, as most of you know, ruling the Riverlands," he said, warming to his subject. "I am a Tully. The trident is the heart of—" Yara made an obscene gesture of fatigue, and someone laughed. Edmure's ears went even redder. Sansa watched him with something like pain, remembering a man who had tried to do right and been mistaken and humiliated for the mistake. She held his gaze, shook her head once very gently. He swallowed. He sat down. His mouth twitched in the ghost of a self-mocking smile, and she loved him a little for it. "What of Gendry Baratheon?" Davos said. "He's a good lad, better than most, and he's got a name now that carries weight, whether he wanted it or not." "Gendry," said the Westerlander, already calculating the implications like a man weighing coin. "A bastard legitimized by a dead usurper queen, inheriting a throne melted by a mad one. It has a pleasing poetry." "The poetry matters less than the bard," Tyrion said. "But it matters. The people have heard the name Baratheon for a long time. The boy has no taste for cruelty. All to the good. It will make him easy to betray." Yara laughed outright. "You'd make a better jester than a hand. I would make a better librarian than most hands. It's not the world we live in." Tyrion looked up then, met Sansa's eyes. He did not say her name. He did not need to. Some of them had already begun to pivot toward her, their bodies revealing their political arithmetic as clearly as if they had drawn it on the flagstones. She had expected it. She felt the hall's attention like a change in weather, a sudden brightness behind cloud, a chill that meant snow by nightfall. They would want her because she did not want what they wanted. That was how they made queens and monsters and martyrs, by the wrong calculations at the right moment. She rose. The hush that followed was clean. "I have brought the North through a winter of dead men and living fools," she said. "I have no wish to sit the chair that destroyed the city that made it." A murmur. The Westerlander's mouth opened, closed. Yara's head came up, curious. "The people of the North have memory longer than this hall," Sansa went on. "We will not bend our knee to a capital that thinks us lodgers in our own halls. We will not be its shock absorbers, its wolves on a chain, its bright banners to cover dark doings. We will be what we have always been ourselves." "And so the North is to be independent," said the Westerlander, scoffing. "Again." "Yes," Sansa said simply, "but not alone." The quiet changed, sharpened. Tyrion's eyes narrowed in interest. Davos blinked and then smiled, as if some small craft had sailed in exactly where a shoal ended. "We are tired," Sansa said. "The Riverlands are tired. The Vale has been spared the worst but not the fear of it. The Iron Islands are tired in their way, though they will call it boredom. We know the cost of being ruled from a distance by those who do not know how we starve and how we feast. The Trident has drowned more Southron promises than all the scribes in the capital have written, and still they declare themselves our shepherds. I propose something else." "What?" Yara asked, leaning forward. "And tell it to me fast." "A confederacy," Sansa said, and the word felt like a coin she had minted herself. A northern confederacy of the north, the Riverlands, and the Vale, with the Iron Islands as a special partner, given they will never call anything a confederacy while sober. And if the free folk wish it, they may join us on their own terms. A league of our own, bound by treaty, not by an iron chair. We will recognize a king in the south if the south chooses one, but we will not be his subjects. We will trade, but we will not pay for the privilege of our own labor. We will come to each other's aid when raiders or tyrants come. We will meet in common at Moat Cailin when we must decide what binds us and what doesn't. We will judge together crimes that cross our borders, and otherwise we will leave each other to govern as we know best. We will be many and still one. She let the breath out slowly. And I will not be your queen. Another wave of sound, this time bright with shock. She did not smile. She was more tired than anyone knew, and it took effort to stand without showing it. She felt the scar of the city's ash in her lungs, though she had not breathed it until now. Edmure's face had changed. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a rope thrown from a wall into floodwater. Royce said nothing, which Sansa took as a deep, serious consideration. Yara's grin was all knives and delight. She enjoyed a proposal that put other people's certainties to torch. "And who would lead this league?" asked the polished Westerlander, already irritated by what he could not own. "You?" "No," Sansa said. "I will speak for Winterfell as I have. I will convene the first moot and recommend its shape, and then I will stand where I should. The leadership will be a post that rotates, a steward's chair, not a throne. Every member region will choose its own representative, and together they will choose a high protector. That protector will hold the seal of the League for a term, and then pass it, and no one will call the office with a name that excuses greed." "Gods," Yara said merrily. "You mean to make a thing that cannot be stolen by a man with a big sword. You'll offend half the room." "The half who need offending," Davos said, his voice like warm oak. He ran a finger over his beard. "It could work. It'll work if we let it." "It won't work because you whisper it under this roof," Royce said finally. His tone bore the gravel of winter passes and swordstone. "It will work if the lords beyond this hall agree that it is a thing of theirs to keep. Will the Vale join such a league, Lady Sansa? With sweet Robin upon his cushions and me to mind his throne when he sneezes." Sansa met him head-on, and the space narrowed to just the two of them. Two keepers of mountains and their obligations. "The Vale has known the advantages of keeping its own counsel," she said. "But the world beyond its plateau has a way of climbing the steps when you build them high enough. You will have trade, Royce. You will have river grain and timber enough to keep your hearths blazing without reaching into the mountain for roots. In return, your knights will ride when Seaguard's bells ring. We are not safe because we stay separate and sneer. We are safe because we have friends whose spleens are as sharp as ours." He did not laugh, but his mouth changed at the corner, just enough that in the Vale they would call it a storm broken by a sliver of light. "You speak like your mother when she had eaten a lemon," he said. "Lady Stark, we will talk." Edmure stood again, this time with no demand for attention. He simply rose so that those who cared to see it could see it, and he looked at Sansa. "The Riverlands will hear you," he said. "We have had our say nodded at many times by men who were already on their way out of the room. But we will hear you." Tyrion's hands lay laced on the table. "There is still the matter of a southern king," he said. "If the Northeast would prefer a league to a throne, the Southwest will prefer a throne to its own chaos." Sansa nodded. "Pick one then. Pick him well." The council exhaled. Gendry looked like a man whose name had been written on a wall in blood and found to be his despite his best efforts to belong to some other man. He stood and stammered and stopped stammering. He said simply that he would do the work, if they trusted him to. Davos put a hand briefly to his shoulder as if steadying him on a pitching deck. It occurred to Sansa that there were worse fates for the South than the rule of a good-hearted smith who remembered that chairs could maim their builders. She walked later with Tyrion along a corridor where the stones were warm with late sun. Once he would have tried to make her smile. Now he kept to his own humor lightly, willing to let grief stay in the room if it wished. "You surprised them," he said. glancing at her. As you surprised me. I expected the first, she said. I hoped for the second. You could have had it, you know? All of it. The chair, the city, the old songs broken into new ones. I could have had a page torn from an old book, and my life set under glass, she said. They paused at a niche where a statue had been, the stone outline still faintly visible, the face gone to dust. I won't be a story for other people to wield. I have stories I would like to make, Tyrion. And you will make them, he said. The difference is, you intend to live inside them. They faced each other a moment longer. There had been a respect between them once which had not required love. There had been pity, which both of them had outlived. There had been harm, which they would own, each in their own way. He bowed. It was a small gesture and unshowy, and it felt like a hinge closing of its own accord. On the ride back, the roads held more travelers. Wagons creaked north with families and bales of cloth and bundles of tools. Sansa asked questions when they stopped. To the old man with the wicker cage of hens, to the seamstress with 5 needles and the haunted look of a woman who had watched her house burn and had remembered to grab the small brass thimble with the rose on it. What people needed was not theory. They needed barrels, bridges, lists, bread. They needed law that did not change when a man changed his coat. Sansa kept the stories anyway, tucked away like seeds. At Moat Cailin they did not pass. They stopped. Sansa had sent ravens ahead. When she and Brienne and the rest rode up onto the stones, flags already moved in the stiffening wind. The Trout of Tully, the Crescent Falcon of Arryn, the 3-headed Trident of Seaguard, the Kraken of Greyjoy, the Merman of Manderley, the White Sun of House Karstark, the Bull Moose of Hornwood, the Reeds of House Reed. A knot of marsh grass tied with a green ribbon. It looked like a storm assembled, then remembered its manners. The lords and ladies made their greetings. Robin Arryn was pale and taller than she remembered, still soft at the edges, with an energy that could turn to cruelty if its infancies were indulged. Lord Yohn Royce stood at his shoulder like a carved promise. Edmure had regained a measure of himself. He carried his tiredness well, more welcome in him than bluster had ever been. The Greyjoy who came was Yara. She laughed at the marsh and spit into it and said it suited her boots. They met in a hall with a roof stitched together from scavenged beams and canvas. The floor swept nearly clean. The gods sent a mist into the loopholes. Sansa coughed once, then began. You each know why you came, she said. You have heard what I propose. The treaties are written here. She gestured to a table where parchment lay weighted with stones. I will walk us through them. She did not speak like a maester. The clauses were short and the words plain. Each region would retain its internal governance. The League would convene a high moot at Moat Cailin twice a year, or more often if war or trouble demanded it. The moot would send judges chosen in threes to try crimes across borders, river piracy, cross-boundary raids, forced taking of land. There would be a levy for shared defense. Each region would send men or ships or grain when one of them needed it, the ratio laid out in ink rather than left to honor's vague recollection. The new gift would be open to settlement by League members, under the auspices of the Night's Watch, to replenish the fields emptied by war and resurrect farms that had become graves. The free folk would be welcome to trade at White Harbor and Long Lake under protection, if they chose it, and if any of the kingdoms south of the Neck harmed them in League territory, the moot would consider it a violation. She left the matter of religion blank. Let the Vale pray to its crystals and the riverlands to their 7 and the north to its silent red eyes. She had no wish to lay a net on the gods. She did not name herself anything. The High Protectorate would rotate every 2 years, chosen by the moot. Any region could pull out with a year's notice if the others broke faith, but the table had to agree in writing that faith had been broken. Trade would be open among the League members at a tariff set by the moot. For goods to the south, the tariff would be higher, with certain accommodations for grain sent in famine and for wood when winter bit too hard even for houses used to its teeth. You expect the south to like that? Yara asked through a grin. No, Sansa said. But liking is different from living with. Yohn Royce tapped a finger on the clause regarding passage through the neck. This, he said, makes Howland Reed the most important man from here to the Dreadfort. Howland, who had arrived without anyone seeing him arrive, raised his frog spear in a tiny salute. "I won't let soldiers through who pretend to be pilgrims," he said. "I won't pretend to be polite when a man lies to my face. You won't like me, but I will keep what you ask me to keep." "See that you put your name to it then," Royce said. "We have had enough of gentlemen who promise without ink." They argued all day. The specifics were where traps lay. Edmure wanted the Riverlands levy set in men rather than steel or grain. "Our people must earn that they are not only a road," he said, "but a wall when they choose to be." Yara required the freedom to raid Southron coasts. The biters and brawlers on the Salt needed their custom. But Sansa hooked her on a better prize, a joint fleet for river patrols with Ironborn captains and Manderly's solid ships side by side. "There are pirates who call themselves Southron merchants," Sansa said. "I would see them confounded." "They will be sunk," Yara said, satisfaction making her voice a cutlass. "Confounded is the word I use when I am drunk." "How many votes does each region hold in the High Moot?" Royce asked. "A league like this boils down to counting." "Not votes," Sansa said. "Stones." They looked at her. "Each region brings a bag of stones," she said. "White stones for consent, black stones to refuse, gray stones to ask for more time. The decision is made when there are more white stones on the table than black, and at least one white stone has to come from each region. If a region wants to speak with one voice, it may. If it wants to send 3 people and argue among itself and then lay down a single stone decided by its argument, it may. But every region will place a stone, and none of us will be dragged into decisions we cannot live with by a sea of votes from far away." "I like it," Yara said. "It reminds me of bottomless pockets." "It reminds me of a river bed," Edmure said, and looked happier than Sansa had seen him since they'd met again. They sat Sansa's proposal beside the old maps until twilight smudged the edges of both. Then they signed. The seals thudded in a soft, ceremonial sequence. Trout, falcon, merman, kraken, the rushes of the crannogmen like threads caught in wax. The sound of it made Sansa think of a hard snow finally sliding off a roof, the pressure gone, the air warmer by some small degree. They drank a little. They did not sing. They were too tired for triumph. Trouble found them anyway. It came first not from the south, but from the west, through the Trident, carrying an old rumor and a new brazenness. A company of men had taken Harrenhal, if one could be said to take a place that had already surrendered itself to ruin. They were sellswords mostly, less proud of their banners than of their pay, commanded by a Westerland's knight of restless fortune named Ser Forley Prester, who had survived too many wars without ever finding himself essential. He had found now in the shattered castle, with its monstrous pads of stone and its gaunt shadows, a theater in which to strut and call himself Castellan. He had laid a toll on the river across from the wreck of Lord Harroway's town, and he assessed it brutally. The trade from White Harbor stumbled. Rafts from Fairmarket drifted too far out of the channel when their pilots tried to avoid the tollboat, and men drowned under cargo they had hoped to sell in time to buy bread for winter. Edmure took this like a man who had been personally affronted by the river. He had. The Trident had always been the Tully's artery and their curse. He came to Winterfell with the map and a fury that made him more himself. "They build a new set of twins in the shape of a tollboat," he said, slapping a palm to the table. "And I know whose ghost laughs in his cup over it." "We cut the tollboat in half," Yara suggested helpfully. "With a ship." "We don't have the ship at the Trident, my lady," Davos said, who had sat down with them with the air of a man who had decided to give his wisdom to whomever already showed sense enough to deserve it. "And even if we did, you want to cut without cutting throats you'll need later." "You offer him a better bargain," Sansa said. "And if he refuses, we make it worse for him than any bargain could ever be." They sent letters first, a courtesy and a trap. Sansa offered Ser Forley a position as a river warden under League contract. He would be paid generously. He would be given one of the broken keeps on the Red Fork to make into a seat, land enough for his sons or his men, a title that meant something because it sat on a web that could hold, not because it had been invented to bribe him into obedience. He could coordinate with Manderly captains on river patrols and swell his purse-hunting pirates. It was the offer of a man who had remembered to count, and Sansa had learned that kind of counting from men like Littlefinger and then sharpened it to her own uses. Ser Forley sent back a note that had been composed, she thought, by someone else, then revised by him badly. It said, with more words than necessary, that he did not answer to northern girls, and that he was Castellan of Harrenhal, and that his levy on the river was a matter of local governance. He thinks he can hide inside that ruin and pick the bones of the valley until someone bigger knocks him out of it, Brienne said. There will always be someone bigger. He hopes, I suppose, that by then he will be the one knocking. I knocked on Harrenhal once in my life, Arya said, from the shadows near the fire. Sansa had not heard her come in. She stood now in the brightness, thinner than her memory of the girl and harder, her face pared down to the particular. She wore no sigil on her breast. She smelled faintly of horse and the weather. It was as if the years had made of her no additive but a refinement. The dross burned out, the steel left clean. Sansa crossed and took her hands. She remembered holding them when they were small enough to fit in her own like a pair of birds. Now they were scarred, which told a longer story than many songs. You're back, Sansa said. For a little, Arya answered. I heard things and came to see if they were true. They are. I like your stones. Sansa smiled despite herself. If you've come to kill him, you'll have to stand in a long line. I'll take a number, Arya said, the corner of her mouth flickering. I have time. Yes, but not this time, Sansa said. We must do this a way that teaches other me. And what will happen if they try to do this, rather than a way that teaches them only that they should hide better and hire better guards? Arya shrugged and looked almost pleased. You have Brienne. I suppose that will do. Brienne bowed her head once toward Arya with a formality that did not hide her affectionate respect. They drew the plan among them in a handful of strokes. Manderly's ships would rise up the river under cover of darkness to take the toll boat, not by ramming but by boarding quietly, with men who knew knots and held knives between their teeth. Royce would send 200 of the Vale's mountain knights, lightly armored, to ride the marshy fringes and cut off the company's foraging parties. Edmure would raise 2,000 foot to encircle the roads. The Crannogmen would block the shallow ways so no one could slip without being bitten by a spear that came out of water the color of secrets. And Brienne would lead a small company right through the gate of Harrenhal, because no one expects a woman to ride first at their door. You will need someone inside, Arya said mildly. Brienne did not bother to say no. We have someone inside, she said, looking at Sansa. Do we? Arya asked. We do, Sansa said. She sent ravens not just to lords. She sent one to a woman whose face she remembered only because it had been unremarkable. The woman had cut Sansa's hair once, pretense for a whisper that had saved a kitchen boy from a noose. She had gone south with a tinker and a basket of combs. She wrote back now on rough paper, with ink the color of dried blood, that she worked in the camp at Harrenhal, cleaning the quarters where Ser Forley dined and mocked and made promises he could not keep. She would leave the door unbarred. She would put a black ribbon in her hair the night she did it. She asked for safe passage north in exchange and a chance to marry a man who knew the value of a roof that did not leak. Sansa sent her the promise with a separate sheet naming a cottage and a patch of ground on the edge of a village near White Harbor, with a pond that did not dry up in summer. She ran her finger along the line of the woman's name and said it aloud, to honor the fact that if anyone ever wondered how the door had opened, it was because of her. The night they went in was Welsh black, thick and shining. The toll boat drifted near the reeds, lazy as a spider, the lanterns along its sides painting soft circles that pretended safety. Manderly's men slid up under the stern. They climbed with ropes that kissed the wood. There was no shouting. The few who stirred in their sleep looked up into hands that told them to be quiet if they wanted to live. The line was cut without fuss. The boat went nowhere anymore. In the castle, Brienne led. Her armor was dull and scored, the better to avoid catching starlight. Podrick was at her shoulder and smiling a poor man's smile, the kind that acknowledges fear and makes it a companion rather than a tyrant. The black ribbon was in the woman's hair, the door unbarred. The guard outside was a drunk too impressed by his own cudgel to imagine that death was already behind him. He died without waking. Ser Forley had kept a small court in his candle-splashed hall, playing at lordship. He slept with his boots near the bed and a sword within reach. He reached for it as the door sighed. He saw Brienne first and frowned, because she offended his categories. "This is a mistake," he said. "If you hurt me, men more important than you will." Brienne hit him once with the pommel of her sword. She did it with a subtlety that bespoke practice and mercy. He slumped, and when he woke he would be bound and his wrists would ache, and he would be taken to Moat Cailin, and there he would be offered again the contract he had refused. He would sign it, because in the light of that hall and the mist that breathed at the door, he would recognize that the air of the south had grown thin. The morning showed a League banner on Harrenhal's battered wall where nothing had flown but weather in a long while. The toll was taken down. Edmure stood on the riverbank with his boots in mud and watched the current gleam like muscle. He put his hand to his heart. When he looked up at Sansa, there was a brightness at the edge of his eyes that he did not bother to hide. "We will not be a road today," he said. "We'll be a wall." She took his arm. Together they crossed back over the raw earth to the horses. The woman with the black ribbon watched from behind a post. Sansa caught her eye, nodded, and later a small boat pulled up at a lonelier stretch of bank. And a man with a hook for a left hand and a gentle voice took her and her few belongings aboard and rowed her toward a different life. Men in King's Landing were not pleased. Bronn, who now styled himself Lord of Highgarden and Master of Coin with an ease that made the old names twitch in their graves, sent a taxman to White Harbor with a chest of papers and an unfortunate sense of entitlement. The taxman returned without his chest of papers and with a story about how he had slipped on the quay and fallen in and nearly drowned. Sansa had instructed the quay to be slick that day. It accomplished what moral sermons could not. The next fellow wore better shoes. Tyrion wrote that he understood, and that the city needed Manderley grain, and that Bronn had a certain way of seeing numbers that did not include what he could not pocket. Gendry's letter, written in a hand too large for the paper, was brief and honest. "I am trying to make this right. I do not know what right is yet. I know hungry faces when I see them. Help me get food to them and I will remember who sent it." Sansa had no quarrel with that. She sent grain. She sent it with a note that itemized the cost of the sacks and the men who loaded them and the bread sold at 1/3 its price for as long as this many weeks, and the cost written way down for the village in Flea Bottom whose name she had made a scribe find because it had lost the most in the last burning. The city would pay in time. In the meantime, the city would know. The second trouble came in the form of a southern expeditionary force which turned into an embarrassment the moment it hit the neck. Gendry was not a fool. He had sent knights who knew they were being tested, and corn-fed boys who thought they were marching to instruct northerners on the proper respect owed to a seal. The horses hated the marsh. The mosquitoes loved the men. The crannogmen made a mist that was not entirely natural, though if you asked them, they would name mere reeds and heat and the way air moves over water like a sleeping creature. The southerners woke to find their provisions altered. A sack of barley that had held whetstones instead of grain. A span of canvas cut neatly along its seam, so that the next wind made a sad tent collapse like a sermon losing its place. Howland Reed himself visited their commander one night, simply stepped into the circle of firelight the way a thought steps into a conversation and takes it over. "You can pass," he said, "but not by accident. You may come to parley at Moat Cailin with 20 men, unarmed, with food enough for yourselves only. You will go back through the causeway the next day. If you insist on marching with banners, you will learn that the gods invented mud before they invented men." The commander blinked and agreed. The meeting at Moat Cailin was brief. Sansa did not waste contempt on them. Contempt is a currency that spends too easily and brings you nothing you can eat. She gave them the terms she had already written and sent to the city. The South would honor the League's charter. There would be a tariff schedule for Southern goods entering White Harbor. Crimes committed by Southerners in League lands would be tried by League judges, and the opposite would be true for Northerners caught wreaking mischief in the South, though she tried not to imagine which of her people would think it clever to engage in Southern mischief. The Night's Watch would remain as a thing sacred to both, and men who chose to take the black would be left in peace by both. The commanders listened, clenched their jaws, and left. In the marsh, their men learned again that exits sometimes hurt. Not all the months were quarrel. Most were labor. In White Harbor, a lean woman who had once combed Sansa's hair oversaw the roofing of a cottage where her husband had already planted beans. In Deepwood Motte, Lady Glover's name was spoken with new affection because she had organized the harvest so no field rotted for lack of hands, calling in the mountain clans with promises of ale and smelted iron. In the Vale, a mountain ferry started up again on a stream that had once run red and which now bore whole barrels of salted trout. In the Riverlands, Arya sat on a fence and watched a boy and a girl practice with wooden swords, and when the boy teased the girl and called her too slow, Arya knocked him on his back with a stick and told him that slowness could be turned into patience, and that patience laid men in the ground more often than speed did, and that he would do well to learn from the girl. The boy got up, rubbed his head, and bowed to both of them. It startled Sansa how often the world obeyed kindness when it was trained to it. She signed in her capacity as convener of the first moot and then gave the seal to Edmure for the second year. It weighed his neck down but drew his spine straight. He adjudicated a dispute between a Riverlands miller and a Vale wine merchant about sacks of flour lost in a rainstorm. He essayed the stones for the vote to recognize a free folk trading camp on the shores of Long Lake, and he warmed visibly when a tall woman whose hair was braided with bones stood and explained, with her hands, how money moved when men were not carting it off at sword point. Gray stones turned to white as she spoke, and in the night Sansa went to the Godswood at Moat Cailin, only a sapling there, brave and red, and listened to the wind in its leaves. Sounded new, hopeful, a little like skepticism being taught to sing. She expected the third trouble because there is always a third. It arrived wrapped in silk to mask the stink beneath. The Westerlands had chosen a lord of sorts, a Lannister cousin whose lines of descent would have taken a maester a day to draw out. He called himself Lionel of Lannisport, and he liked to sit a bit sideways in his chair and speak with a rope of pearls running through his fingers, as if the motion steadied him or reminded him what he valued. He had made his money in trade and in the manner of men who traded, which is to say by counting his own coin well and other people's less well. He declared the Trident closed to League ships without a special stamp purchased from his agents. He threatened to seize cargoes of timber bound for Gulltown, claiming that the wood was stolen from Crownland's forests. He wrote letters to Gendry suggesting that if the king kept company with wolves, he might wake one day to gnawed bones. Gendry wrote no letters back but sent to Tyrion and Davos for their counsel, and to Sansa for hers. Sansa's letter to him ran short. "We will not pay him to use what belongs to us. We will not be baited into a war that makes our river a red map of his injured pride. We will escort our goods with our own ships, with swifter boats riding ahead to scout the channel, and at the first sign of his seizure, we will call in the Ironborn with a promise of prizes to burn off their winter laziness. If he seizes a single sack of northern grain to feed his vanity, every southern merchant from Seaguard to Maidenpool will remember for a decade the cost that Lionel Lannister made them pay for his pearls." Tyrion wrote back that it was a pity to see a Lannister so lacking in taste, and that he would persuade Bronn to generate a healthy skepticism toward Lionel's ideas by reminding him that trade dries up when rivers do, and that droughts are as often political as they are meteorological. Davos wrote back that if Sansa meant to ask the Ironborn to be useful, he would send a prayer to new and old gods alike for her success. If anyone could accomplish such a miracle sober, it would be her. Sansa smiled when she read that, but the smile did not reach her stomach. She knew how fast a line could tangle when the currents ran contrary. What came then was a small war, and it was not fought in fields but on water and in ledgers and in the space between the breath going out and the breath coming in when a man decided whether to pull a crossbow trigger. Lionel's hired men tried to seize 2 river barges near salt pans. They climbed with hooks. From behind the bales that should have held wool, League men rose and pulled them under with quiet efficiency, cutting the cords of their grappling hooks and watching with calm interest as the hired men tripped themselves into the water. Yara arrived a day later with 4 swift ships and a crew of men who sang in low voices about knives and weather and women who never had to be paid twice. She found Lionel's largest boat anchored in mid-channel and circled it like a wolf among sheep. The captain came to the rail and shouted. Yara paused as if he were a favorite treat that she was being asked not to eat. She moved and then so close that the hulls touched, and she asked him very politely if he wished to keep his cargo, his boat, and his life, And did he know that 3 was the number of things he could most likely preserve only 2 of, unless he had the luck of a storm and the sense to pick the right god for it? They paid Lionel back in delays and in rumors that made the cost of doing business with him too dear for men who counted their coin carefully. The tariff he had boasted would fill his chests filled, instead the mouths of those he had not considered. He tried temper and found that the League was patient. He tried patience and found that the League had memory. He wrote to Bronn, who scratched himself and ignored him, and to Tyrion, who wrote back a letter about the mathematics of appetite that gave nothing and promised nothing and taught Lionel how unpleasant it could be to have to read a true thing written in good phrases. Sansa slept little in those months. In their place, she lived many days fully. She listened to Alice Karstark argue for more grain to be laid up in last hearth, observed that the memory of hunger taught men to believe in ghosts even in daylight. She hung a new bell in the whitewashed chapel at Moat Cailin where river judges ate their cold soup and bit their ink-stained bread. Its sound was clear and neither happy nor sad, and travelers learned to listen for it because the bell's ring meant that a thing had been decided. She sat long with Howland Reed and did not ask him about the tower and the secret that had sent a boy she loved to a life she did not choose for him. She asked him instead about mists, and he taught her about weather and about waiting for what belongs to the moment. "You do not invent the mist," he said. "You let it come. Then you use it." The South changed shape quietly, as all large things do. Gendry married a woman of good sense and no sigil, and the city forgave him for the latter because it learned to love her for the former. He did not always choose well, but he chose as if it mattered, and the realm showed him a loyalty that had a lower boiling point than what it had given to men who chose from malice rather than confusion. Tyrion grew thinner and a trifle more careless in his dress, as if he had decided that his clothes would no longer be asked to do work that his decisions could do better. Bronn found a love for hunting that kept him out of the counting houses when Tyrion needed him kept out of them. The Prince of Dorne, still new to that chair and suspicious of chairs in general, sent a cool letter acknowledging the League's existence and adding a postscript that read, "Through patience, the knife can be made to cut the air." Sansa kept that one. She liked men who sent their meaning to arrive half a day later than their words. There were storms. A fever took a third of a village near Last Hearth, and Sansa stood with Brienne under a stripped linden tree and told a woman that had she the art, she would lay a hand on her child's head and draw the heat out and swallow it herself, but she had no such art and could only stand and say the true thing. That this too was the world, and that it would pass and leave scars that would ache on certain mornings, and that they would burn the bodies carefully and build a wall of stones that did not wobble, and that she would send a mason who knew his work. She received one letter that had been written on bark, only 3 words: "Snow falling north." It had been a lover's code once. Now it meant that the free folk would come down with trade that made her quartermasters frown and the children squeal with delight. Carved bone whistles and knives made of old, beaten steel that gleamed like a hard cord caught in the throat. She and Arya walked once along the outer wall of Winterfell in late afternoon. The air wore a wet copper taste, the prelude to a storm that might or might not arrive. Arya squinted up at the sky and said nothing. Sansa waited, learned to leave the silence where her sister loved it. "You are not going west," Sansa said at last, not a question. "I will," Arya said, "but not yet. Your stones are more interesting than the empty sea. You can make a life without the empty, you know." "I already have," Arya said. She did not smile, but Sansa felt a warmth that did not need a curve of mouth to prove itself. They stopped at a crenel. The snow far out to the north looked like the sea might look if it had congealed and forgotten its storms but not its salt. Sansa thought of Jon, and for the first time in months the thought did not brin. Gia stabbed but a deep, sad ache. She had not written him much. She had written him enough. He was where he had learned to be who he had been most clearly. That had to be enough for both of them. "Do you want it sometimes?" Arya asked softly. "When the hall is still and the last candle's guttering and you can hear men turning in their sleep in their beds. Do you want the chair then?" Sansa had not thought she would be asked. She took a breath and let it out. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes I want it because it would be easy to have one decision. To order a thing done and it is done. To speak and not have to listen. To make the map simple. To answer the question of who with the answer of me. There's a thrill in it. I'm not so good I can pretend there isn't. But I have learned that what comes after the thrill is a long sickness. And I prefer this other kind of long. Arya nodded as if she had expected the answer. I prefer moving, she said. But I see the beauty in a good wall. When you've seen men break themselves on bad ones, you learn to admire a wall what holds. In the second spring of the League they called a greater moot. Delegations came by road and river and marsh and sea. The hall at Moat Cailin had a proper roof then, and windows that looked out onto the channels of water that cut the land into a green-brown geometry. Children ran with kites. A free folk woman in a red hat hawked pastries dusted with something white that tasted like cold, and Sansa bought one and ate it and did not ask what had dusted it. A troop of bards did not sing of kings, and people listened anyway. Gendry himself came without crown or collar, wearing plain leather and a look like a man stepping into a house where he once ate a pie and had not forgotten whose hands had rolled the crust. He asked for nothing Sansa could not give, which meant he asked for what mattered. A promise of grain for the city in a year when they had misjudged the planting. A guarantee that men who fled the south to avoid a corrupt judge would be returned if the judge was judged by the League to be honest. A schedule of river pilots that would make sure ships did not ground themselves like obstinate pigs on sandbars and then curse the north for the river's stubbornness. He stood with Sansa on the flat roof at dusk. The marsh glowed with a dark light. The mists kindled and struck sparks where the sun touched them. His hair had gone more gray at the edges than his age would account for. His hands bore faint scars not from war but from nails driven wrongly and then pulled out and driven again. He looked like a man learning a trade he would never finish. She respected that. I thought I would prefer hammers to quills, he said. I was wrong. A quill is a hammer. It can hit harder than a man expects if you use it right. You have men who teach you to use it, Sansa said. I do, he said. And you have men who know how to make mist. Men and women, she said. Always add the women in your count. There are more of us than you think. He nodded. Silence fell. It was the good kind, not the kind that invents a quarrel to fill itself. When he spoke again, his voice sounded like a man still not used to people listening when he was not pounding iron. They call me King of the Undulls and the First Men, he said, self-mocking, tender with it. I am not sure how many of them I am. They call you Lady of Winterfell and many other names. Some of them are kind and some are not. But they don't call you Queen. You did that. I did, Sansa said. And I will do it again, each time someone forgets. Then let us write it down, Gendry said, turning to her. Let us write that the South recognizes the League as a sovereign thing, and that the League recognizes the South's king as the head of those who choose him, and that both will stay to their sides of the neck unless asked and paid for in coin above board, and that if a man in the South steals a League merchant's cargo, he will answer to League law, and if a northerner kills a man in the king's city, he will answer to the king's justice, and that neither of us will levy tolls without sending word to the other a month before, and that when there is plague we will help, and when there is famine we will share, and when there is a new spring we will dance whether we want to or not. Sansa could not help the sound that escaped her then, a laugh as brief and clean as a bird's flight. And what shall we call such a treaty? She asked. He thought, then shrugged. The Treaty of the Neck. It sounds rude and true. It does, she said. And it will hold because we will hold it. They signed the next day. The stones laid on the table were all white. Even Yara threw hers down with a flourish and then drank harsh liquor and told a story about how she had once convinced a sea to knock over and make way. Howland Reed nodded like a man who had watched fog do much the same. Sansa slept that night in a room whose walls still smelled of new-washed rushes and smoke. She dreamt of the gods' wood at Winterfell. When she woke before dawn, the marsh mist stroking the window, Brienne waited outside with a cup of something hot and the patient expression of a woman who knew she would have to stand for a long time again and which of her feet would ache first. Sansa took the cup, sipped, and felt warmth settle in the hollows of her chest. She thought of the Iron Throne then, melted into uselessness, and felt a bolt of gratitude so fierce it startled her. She had refused a crown to build a thing that might outlive crowns. Years are made of days. Story prefers to slide from peak to peak, but life sets its table with bread and nails and the slow pay of routine. Sansa's days were set that way now. She sat the hall. She took riders whose horses limped. She spent 2 hours in the kitchen watching a boy learn to ladle stew without spilling half of it in the rushes. She read, at night, by a candle that jumped when the YND pried its way in through the shutters. She went out sometimes alone with a guard on the wall while the moon flayed the clouds and bared their bones. The north breathed around her, a great, old animal, trusting in her not to butcher it into parts for sale, not to starve it out of carelessness, not to put a jeweled collar on it and set it to dancing for a crowd that had never loved it. Not everything held perfectly. The Free Folk trading camp suffered a rash of theft that turned out to be a Hornwood boy who had liked a girl from over the water. Rather than a hand, he lost a summer working the camp's latrines and learning their songs. He married the girl. An argument between Manderley's factor and a pious man from the Vale about whether wine shipments desecrated the idea of temperance escalated until Sansa found herself sitting between them while a storm hammered at the shutters and the lamp smoked with indignation. She told the factor that wine was wood and water and time and patience, and that the Vale could pay less tariff if it guaranteed to keep its bottles in the dark and its sermons by the hearth. She told the pious man that men who ate too much bread were more to be pitied than men who drank too much wine, and that she had lost none of her patience for those who tried to figure out what other men did with their evenings. They laughed then and stopped being as proud as they had been when they began. A girl from White Harbor wrote in a schoolroom hand begging permission to open a shop on the road to the neck that would sell paper and ribbon and twine, the very goods needed by a world that wrote as much as it fought. Sansa sent her a small loan and the names of 3 women who would advise her without asking in return for half her profit. Months later, a ribbon came in a parcel, dyed a blue so deep it made Sansa think of a summer sea she would likely never see. She tied it in her hair one morning and caught her reflection and did not think she looked like a girl. She thought she looked like who she had chosen to be. When the first winter after the treaty came, it came hard. The mists at the neck thickened and froze along their edges so that the marsh wore lace. The wall groaned. Men in the watch wrote that it still stood, and that it could stand even when no one sang it into hardness with magic old as men's first languages. Men learned the lesson they always tried to learn again, that the world did not end, that the body could be warmed with the labor of warming another. Women learned again that their hands could harden bread into survival, that their fingers could count hearts under blankets and find them beating, that the litany of a day was its own courage. Sansa sent out the last of the emergency grain and signed the letters that released it with a certain ferocity. She preferred the black ink against white paper to be a promise that would force the world to keep up with it. She slept through one night without waking only because exhaustion pushed her down like the palm of a god. She went to the godswood in the blue hour before dawn. The heart tree's face regarded her with its enduring blankness. The snow on the branches made a lace more enduring than marsh ice. She spoke aloud then, not from superstition, but from the need to hear the words shaped in a place where the words would be met with patience. "I have done this thing," she said. "I have made this league. I have refused to climb the tallest ruin and call it a mountain." She shut her eyes. "Help me keep it." The wind moved through, but no voice answered. She did not expect one. She had the answer already, in the backbreaking work of building in a place where others had so often commanded to their own advantage, in the people who were learning that they could decide what they called themselves and then live inside the name without choking, in the paper shop on the neck that sold out of ribbon each spring and then ordered more, in the sound of a bell at Moat Cailin and the way men ceased speaking to hear what followed it, and in the quick nods that moved around a room. When stones turned from gray to white to black and back again, not because a queen had said so, but because they understood what they had chosen. On a morning in late thaw, Arya left. She did it as she did most things, with frankness. She hugged Sansa in the yard. The snow had lost its edge. The air felt less like teeth and more like breath. "I'll write," Arya said. "You won't," Sansa said, and they both laughed. "Then I'll come back," Arya said. "You will," Sansa said. She touched Arya's cheek with the back of her fingers. "Go find what isn't there yet, and come back with news of it." Arya swung up onto her horse and then down again to hug Brienne, which made Brienne blush in a way that made both of them look almost young. She shook Podrick's hand. She rode out the gate with the sun sliding loose from a cloud and breaking on her hair. Sansa stood on the step until the horse and the rider and then the track of their passing had smoothed into air. She went back inside and sat a moment with the strange quiet that had its own taste. A shade of salt, a hint of iron. In the 5th year, when Gendry came again to renew the treaty and to apologize for a smaller sin not his own, he found that the League did not look like a rebellion anymore. It looked like normal. That was Sansa's victory. To make it boring. To make it the thing you told a child at night when she asked how the world worked. That a man in one place counted on a woman in another to hold up her end of a rope. That if you put your stone on the table and it was white, you meant it. That if you put it black, you could be argued with but not dragged. That if you put it gray, you would be fed while you thought. He brought her a carving, a hammer and a quill crossed, made of a dark wood bowed from a shipwright near Shipbreaker Bay. She placed it on the shelf above her desk, between a small carved LF she had kept as a girl and a folded scrap of cloth that had once been part of a dress she had worn while it was dangerous still to wear the stark colors. The shelf felt balanced then. What had made her, what she had made, what she had refused, and the tool with which she worked. Years later, a grandmother told a child at White Harbor why the wheat came when it came and how it found its way up to Winterfell without loss. She spoke of stones and of nights when the mist off the marsh smelled like an old promise kept. She spoke of a lady who had been asked to be a queen and had made instead a table no one could flip without flipping the world it was set upon. The child raised a hand and asked a question, as children will. The grandmother laughed and said she did not know the answer to that one, and that perhaps the child should go one day to Moat Cailin and watch the stones being put down on the table and see what men and women said when they were finished and how they bore themselves when they stood. The child chewed this gravely and then went outside to throw snow at her brother. Sansa's hair silvered at the temples. Brienne's knee stiffened so that she rose from chairs as if fighting a small war against them. Podrick sang better than he ought. Edmure's beard went white, but his laugh never changed. Yara took a lover who told her the truth without staying quiet for any payment. And there were nights of shouting and mornings of smug contentment. And the ships stayed seaworthy. Howland Reed died in a boat on water the color of old coins. He had wanted that, and so it had been arranged without fuss. The bell at Moat Cailin rang when it needed to. The treaties were recopied when the ink faded. Once, at the end, when the snow fell as it had fallen in the beginning, Sansa went alone into the Godswood again and pressed her hand to the tree. Its bark was cold. The red sap was the red it had always been. She thought of the chair that had melted and of the thing she had made that could not. She thought of Jon, of Arya, of her mother's hand smoothing hair back from a fevered brow. She thought of Ned's face in shadow and how it had looked the first time she had understood that goodness did not guarantee survival, that it guaranteed nothing at all, and that this was not a reason to abandon it. She did not ask for counsel. She did not need to. She listened to the wind and then to the quiet after the wind. She did not ask permission, and she did not ask forgiveness. She laid a hand on the tree and kept it there until the cold made the bones in her hand ache. Then she let go. The snow turned her tracks into indistinctive shapes, but she knew her way back by memory and by the light spilling from hall to hall. A banner stirred in the draft. Wolf's head, stitched not for awe but for recognition. The sign a child looks for when she has walked too far and wants to know she is nearly home. So she went back into the house that was hers, not as a queen, but as something older and harder to break. A steward of what lived and a maker of a law that was only this: keep faith. Put down your stone, hold your end. And if, in the night, she woke and felt the pull of old hungers, she set her palm against the wood of her desk on the shelf where the hammer and the quill lay crossed, and she remembered that some refusals are themselves an act of creation. Then she slept again, the snow laying its soft weight over the world she had taught to stand.